Hello there, Deep Voice here again. And today I have my good friend David Goa. David Goa, introduce yourself.
Well, I'm a friend of yours. That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
I teach religious studies, and I'm the director of the Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life, based at the Augustana campus of the University of Alberta.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyway, so today I have my good friend David Goa, and we're going to be talking today about the New Age movement, Wicca, and actually the multifaceted aspects of the New Age movement. Anyways, David Goa, as a theology teacher, what's been your experience working with the New Age movement? Like, you're Orthodox yourself, but what's been your experience working with the New Age movement and your overall feeling and experience working with people in that particular movement? I'm not a part of that movement myself, but I do have a lot of friends who are a part of that. And I've, like I say, studying theologies around the world, that's been part of my studies, per se, of the New Age movement. Which it is indeed, it's a very interesting movement on many parts, because a lot of people argue you're born into the religion you're raised in, or you're from this country, that's going to be your religion. However, we see all these changes in demographics. New Ageism is growing. Atheism is growing. And that would really argue against determinism, because many people will say, well, if you grew up in a Catholic country, you must be Catholic, or you grew up in, let's say, England or Germany, therefore you must be a Protestant. These New Age movements really demonstrate that particular thinking is false, because the very fact they're growing in traditionally Protestant lands, that was just, people are drawn to this, and there would be an element of choice, per se. But what's been your experience with the New Age movement, working with individuals in the New Age movement?
Well, we all know people that have found new spiritual disciplines or a new worldview because they've attached themselves to what are commonly called New Age movements. Most New Age movements aren't new at all.
Really?
Religious forms that have been kicking around often for 2,000 to 5,000 years in part of the world. So I think the central thing to me is to appreciate why they have been attracted to those new ways of marketing really ancient religious ideas.
Yep.
And what is the effect of that? So there's just a couple things that strike me about it. One is that people that move in that direction are first and foremost seeking meaning. Mm-hmm. They're seeking some kind of meaning for life, and seeking, in some cases, also seeking some spiritual disciplines of some sort. Mm-hmm. And they're seeking them, I suppose, in part because they haven't found them in their childhood, and they haven't found them when they became teenagers. And so if they were in churches or in the synagogue, they have not found what they were looking for that was compelling enough, that made a demand on them, that laid hold of them enough. So that's one thing that I think I certainly one sees. But another one, it's kind of the other side of this, and maybe the shadow side of it. You know, religious traditions, the great religious traditions, they don't just offer you something.
Oh, very good.
They require something of you. They make a demand on you.
Yes. That's very true. Like in Judaism, they will reject somebody 3 times before they let the new person into some forms of Judaism.
Well, religious traditions, contrary to the way in which most people think about it, aren't first and foremost about belief. They're first and foremost about practice.
Okay, cool.
And about what I would call spiritual discipline. Mm-hmm. And spiritual discipline is just like athletic discipline or the discipline of an artist. If you want to become good at it, you have to work at it. You have to exercise the disciplines. So I also have a sense, Derek, and I don't know if you would share this, that at least a number of people that I have known, and they don't have to be young either, part of, I don't know for sure, but I have a sense that part of the reason they have rejected traditional religious forms is because, for one reason or another, they have become afraid of the authority within those forms. That is, they've become afraid of what those religious traditions require of us. Now, one has to be careful here, because religious leaders can require all sorts of ridiculous things.
Yeah, that is true.
That happens all the time. Because religious leaders are not necessarily properly trained and formed within their own tradition. But religious traditions themselves are an amazing set of disciplines for understanding life, for making our way through the world, for coming to terms with our estrangement, for being capable of growing in love and compassion. That's the purpose of those disciplines. So I sometimes wonder if the fear of authority and the fear of what is required is part of why people have fled from traditional religious forms. Another aspect I wonder about, we live in a kind of hyper-individualistic world.
That's very true.
Where everybody can have whatever they want, presumably, which of course is not true, but we market this fantasy. And the other gift, of course, of religious traditions is that the religious traditions are held within a community. And in a sense, when you take on the disciplines of a religious tradition, you do it in the context of a kind of community. A community of reasonably like-minded people, a community that share a discipline. So if you become part of a sports team, you're part of the group that does that. If you're part of an orchestra, you're part of a group that does that. Well, religious communities have a similar kind of character. You become part of the community and you work out your salvation, as it says, within the context of that community. I think we live in a world in which the general regard for community has become very low, and we don't have much capacity for it. We seek fraternity, that is, we seek like-minded people, but we don't really seek communities. And so I also sometimes wonder if some people who are part of these newer movements are there because on the one hand they want meaning, but they want the meaning as they understand it. They don't want to rub it up against other people and find out where its metal really is. But all that being said, to me the most important thing is that people that are drawn to any religious movement, they are drawn there because of the movement of their heart and their mind. They are seeking something. And so we need to have a regard for that and to try and understand what it is that's being sought and to engage it in a kind of hospitable way. So these movements are, I think many of them are actually trying to recover something. Many of them are trying to recover a proper regard for the body. Many of them are trying to recover a healthy view of human sexuality and not see the body as a dying animal or see sexuality in negative ways, ways it may have been painted by their religious teachers. And many of these people are also seeking a healthy understanding of nature, the wonder and glory of nature, and that many New Age movements have disciplines around ostensibly what would have been called in the ancient world the kind of worship of nature, seeing nature as animate, seeing every rock, every mountain, every tree as sacred. Well, that impulse is a pretty healthy impulse. Because it is an impulse to regard, to be attentive to the gift of creation. Now, we have in the biblical tradition, going back to the Hebrew prophets, all the way through, I think, all the way through St. Francis of Assisi, a concern in Jewish and Christian thinking about what would be often called paganism. Well, the word is a lovely word. You know what the word really means? Paganius. Paganius means wilderness. The place where the human hand has not influenced everything. The place of surprise. The place of wonder. The place where the energy of creation manifests itself in all kinds of ways, not just in the human way. Well, that's a good thing. that's a good thing, because creation is much larger than just human beings.
Yep.
But in the biblical tradition and in Christianity, in a kind of struggle around what really is the meaning of creation and the meaning of our life as human beings as part of creation, there developed a kind of competition between religions around a number of these things.
Yep.
And in a number of the ancient religions, they were preoccupied with trying to propitiate what they saw as the deities behind all the phenomena of life.
Okay.
So let me give you an example. In many religions, there is a deity of the hearth for
Yep.
the home, the household deity.
Yep.
Now, what is that saying? Well, at its best, I think it is saying home and hearth are sacred.
Mm-hmm.
They're powerful. You know, the sacred isn't necessarily nice. It's powerful. It can be divine and demonic. So the hearth and the home, if you have a good home, it's a wonderful blessing in your life.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderful gift to you, and it makes you much more able to enter into the world and participate in the world, much more able to welcome strangers and to share the gifts that you've gotten in life. So there's no question about the sacredness of the home and the sacredness of family. But think for a moment of what happens when you are in a situation where the notion of home and family is deeply defined tribally.
Okay. Tribalism.
And think particularly of what happens then if in fact a girl child in that home,
Mm-hmm.
because it usually breaks down around gender,
Yep.
a girl child in that home becomes a young woman
Mm-hmm.
and takes a fancy for a young man from over the hill, from another tribe,
Yep.
or even from another religion.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens in that context? Well, the notion of the sacredness of the home and the sacredness of the family and the sacredness of the tribe means that that person has stepped beyond the boundary that one can bear.
Yes.
That's where we get what's called honor killings.
Yep.
That's where we get, and you don't have to go very far to see that phenomenon. It may not involve physical death, but all kinds of people have been cast out of their family
Yes.
because they fell in love with, or thought they did, somebody that the family didn't approve of.
Mm-hmm.
That is a very common phenomenon. Well, within the Jewish and Christian tradition, this notion that something like home and family and tribe and hearth are sacred is there.
Okay.
Yes, it's sacred. But what this tradition is saying begins with Abraham.
Yep.
This tradition is saying, yes, it's sacred, but it's not God.
Okay.
God is above that.
Yep.
God is the possibility for surprise. God is the possibility for changing the terms of reference. God is the possibility for seeing family, home, tribe in larger terms, in terms more open to the new, more open to the stranger. So we often say that this biblical tradition of the notion of, I like to use an old term that Mircea Eliade used, the great scholar of the history of religions, this notion that there is a God above the gods. That is, you have a deification of all kinds of aspects of life, hearth and home and tribe, sexuality, reproduction, the planting of grain, the seeing of the new moon. I mean, all of these things, in a sense, all of them are a wonder. They're all a wonder. And we should have a high regard for them. But when we deify them, when we make them animate, see them as deity of some sort,
Yep.
what the biblical tradition is saying, you have to be careful with that.
Yep.
On the one hand, you have to hold the regard lightly Because there is a God above the gods. That is, the divine energy of the cosmos can actually transform everything.
Yep.
And make all things new. Not just reaffirm what you know to be sacred, but make all things new. So my sense is that part of the struggle that we see in the ancient world, we see it in the Hebrew scriptures. And we see it in Christian thought. Part of that struggle is a struggle around this issue. Yes, care for what is sacred. Yes, family, reproduction, loving, making love. All these things are sacred, but they're not God. God is able to surprise us and to pull other things forward. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, and actually that's kind of goal, like I understand through Orthodoxy, it's transfiguration, it's the recreation of the universe, recreation. I think we covered a little bit of that in the last video as well, but also thinking back what John Chrysostom said. St. John Chrysostom talked about basically seeing your neighbor as an extension to your tribe.
Well, it's so interesting, the notion of family in the Bible, and certainly in somebody like Chrysostom as well. The notion of family was never a husband, a wife, and 2 kids. I mean, it always was a kinship group, a much larger kinship group. But as we see in Jesus, those kinship groups, they can be great for those who are in the inside, but they become problematic if you're ever cast out. So one of the things we see in Jesus' narratives is, I think, a complete reinterpretation of the notion of who's in and who's out. And what Jesus is doing is he's saying, everybody's in.
Really?
Everybody's in. Well, what does he do? He crosses all these boundaries. He's with the leper. They're out. They're in for him. He's with the woman taken in accused of adultery. She's not out. She's in. He's with the tax collector.
Tax collectors were
the tax collector's in too.
Tax collectors were actually considered worse than sinners. I mean, in
well, of
Jesus'
course.
time.
But what Jesus does is he said, no. Remember, this is a human being. Don't reduce him to a tax collector. I will go and have dinner with him.
That's very true.
And he calls Zacchaeus down and goes to his house for lunch. And even Longinus, the centurion soldier at the foot of the crucifixion, when Jesus is crucified on the cross, even the centurion soldier is in and receives the blessing of God. So part of the challenge here, and I think it's a very human one, so it's not either or, it's a question of how do we regard the sacred things of life, that is the powerful things of life. Family, friendship, loving, death, birth, the planting of grain, the harvesting of grain, all the wonderful things about life which are powerful. How do we have a proper regard for them and understand, yes, they are part of the sacredness of life, but at the same time, not deify them, not make them sort of symbols of why I am right and my people are right and you aren't. Jesus builds a bridge across that constantly and invites us to travel that bridge all the time without denying the significance of any one of them, but helps us not elevate any one of them to the point, I like to put it, to the point where we cannot be surprised by its transformation.
Okay.
That makes sense to you?
Yes. Yes, I mean, it's like I said, what I was saying earlier with what John Chrysostom said. And actually, I remember what Jesus,
what John Chrysostom was talking about the fact that whoever you think is in your family is in your family. But there are all kinds of other people that are also part of your family, including the stranger that comes to the door and knocks on the door and doesn't even have breath left to ask for a crust of bread. they are your brother, they are your sister.
Mm-hmm.
And you do not have a Christian home, Chrysostom said.
Mm-hmm.
You do not have a Christian home if you send them to the hostel for the poor. You must bring them into your home and give them a bed and a crust of bread and a candle and give them your hospitality and your friendship. It's pretty demanding.
That's deep.
Very demanding.
And I actually remember quite when they were in Byzantine history, when they were actually they were passing laws about rejecting new immigrants and whatnot. Chrysostom really stood up to the emperor leadership of his day.
That's right. Well, yeah, the emperor passed a law saying there could be no street people within the walls of Constantinople.
Really?
And he did exactly what Premier Ralph Klein did in Alberta. Premier Klein offered all the street people in Alberta a one-way ticket to British Columbia because he wanted to get rid of them so we didn't have to deal with them. It's an amazing act. Our
Really?
premier did this, and very few spoke up against it. The emperor did the same thing.
Yep.
So he passed the law saying you had to have a permanent address or be exiled from the walls of the city. But then what he did, and this is where Chrysostom is interesting,
Yep.
then what he did is he turned around and he granted a license to the bishops in Constantinople, because there were a number of bishops there
Yep.
under the Archbishop Chrysostom. He offered them a license to open a hostel for the poor.
Mm-hmm.
Now that seems like a good, sensible thing to do.
Yep.
I mean, this is the origins of social services.
Yep.
But Chrysostom found it heinous.
Really?
And here's why. Chrysostom said, when he got wind of this,
Yep.
he actually preached it
Mm-hmm.
to the emperor who was sitting up in the balcony in the great church there,
Yep.
where the Hagia Sophia now stands, and with some of his own bishops around. He said,
Brave man.
what you are doing here is destructive of the Christian home.
There we go.
So it's not about whether there should be hostels or not. It's about what the bishop should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
The bishop should be encouraging the Christian home to grow. And Chrysostom said, you do not have a Christian home if you don't have a bedroll, a loaf of bread, and a candle waiting for the unseen guest. When you come home from work or from shopping, from your daily tasks, you may meet the stranger on the street who asks you for help. Someone may knock at your door who needs help. If you do not have the bedroll, the bread, the candle there, and welcome them, then no matter how many times you go to church, no matter how many times you go to communion and confession, it's not Christian.
Really?
You haven't got it. You aren't doing it. Because that person, Chrysostom said, and he said it because Jesus said it, that person that you meet, that person that comes to the door is Jesus Christ.
Yes.
You are refusing to welcome the one who bears the image of God. So this is an amazing and I think compelling idea, but one that we have really lost. So what we've done is we kind of outsourced social services.
But it's also interesting with Christianity. In the past, I mean, you see many like in the ancient Greek religions. I mean, Alexander claimed to be descended from Zeus, Alexander the Great, and there's a lot of people. I mean, there was this. If you were descended from the gods, you were indeed special. Christianity, everyone can be adopted by God.
Everybody is in the image of God
Already.
already.
And there's not a select
And
special group, i.e. royalty.
That's right. It's not the emperor. In fact, the emperor might be the only one who isn't. He's got his name on a coin.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a very good point. This idea in many societies is a privileged idea. If you're the ruler, or if you have a certain order, then you are understood to be in the divine image. So you've pointed to something very important here. And what the Hebrew Bible does in the book of Genesis, the original narrative of creation, it says everyone is the image of God if you have the being of the human. Not because of what you do, not because of your power, not because of how you behave, but because of your being. Your being means that you share in the divine nature.
Just the very fact you're a human being and alive.
Yeah, yeah.
Fascinating.
So it's it really is a tradition that is affirming human dignity in a remarkable way.
Fascinating. It's also interesting in Christian history, like the first hospital was founded by the three women here. I'm sorry you pronounce their names.
Philanella, Sananita, and Hamirani. Early Christians founded lots of institutions. What Chrysostom is on about here isn't that you shouldn't find ways to be helpful to large groups of people. He is saying, of course, we need to do everything we can to help people in all kinds of conditions.
Yes.
But don't forget that the home is meant to be the place for the stranger. The home and the family don't exist without the stranger. And my father, when I was a child, we would go uptown and he would always give something if he had it to a person who was begging or invite them to come and have something to eat.
Yep.
And when I was a kid, he would often invite them to come home. But particularly around Christmas time, on Christmas Eve, if we go up shopping on Christmas Eve, and if my father could find somebody to come home for Christmas Eve, then that was really Christmas. In his view, you couldn't have Christmas without the stranger. And that, of course, is central to the biblical narrative. Larger community. Not the one who rules as a despot, but the one who serves and makes life better for all of us together. So it's a shared idea.
Okay. But one critic of a good friend of mine made this criticism. Like in Genesis, it basically says, humans were given lordship over creation. Some would have interpreted that meaning we could plunder, we can destroy. We're just there to dominate and control. Others have a more holistic approach, saying we're basically lordship, meaning we need to care for and nurture existence, or care for this earth per se, or a reality. How do you understand that?
Well, there are lots of people who've made this argument. I think there's just a couple things that I would like to say about it. One is that the domination of creation as we see it now was never possible prior to industrialization.
Yep.
So this isn't about Christianity or about the Bible. This is about what happened with the development of industrialization and the capacity of our modern science and technology to mine the world and degrade it in a way that could never have been done before. Secondly, read that story. That's what I would say.
Okay, go.
What are human beings made of? What does Adam mean? It means soil.
Okay.
We are soil.
Yes.
So this notion that human beings are to have dominion is the way it's translated in the King James Version of the Bible. But what's there in the overall narrative is that human beings are the gardeners of the world, not the miners of it. They're the gardeners of the world. And if you are a gardener, what do? You tend, you cultivate, you help grow, you harvest as well. If you look at the overall creation narrative, and there are two of them, of course, there are two creation narratives in Genesis, and you look at the whole narrative, what is being said here about the human nature? Well, the human nature is a gardener. The human nature is not a miner.
Okay.
The human nature is to cultivate and to help grow. And one of the most beautiful things about it, at least to me, is that there is this Adonai, blessed be He, you know, as Jews refer to God. Adam and Eve are asked to name the animals.
Yep.
Well, we have to remember what that means in Hebrew. Naming is blessing. When you name and when you call something by name, it is a blessing. It is a regard for the wonder of the being of the person or of the animal or of the flower. So naming itself is the essential priestly act. All human beings in the biblical world and in our tradition are priests.
Oh, really?
Like we have priests in the church,
Yep.
but we are priests much more fundamentally than they are priests.
Okay.
They are priests for the church. We are priests for creation. That's out of our baptism and out of our being in the world. So the Jewish tradition, coming out of the Jewish tradition, there is this idea in that narrative, and beautifully illustrated in that narrative, that all human beings, men, women, and children, are essential, their essential vocation is priestly. That is, it is to bless the world.
Okay.
It is to bless and name the world. Why? Well, in some ways, it is part of enlarging our consciousness of the wonder and gift of all of nature and our place in it. So blessing is naming.
Okay.
It is regarding. It is saying, isn't it a wonder that you are, that I am? Isn't it a wonder that my cat exists? Isn't it a wonder that goats and sheep exist? Isn't it a wonder that tall yellow flowers exist? It's a way of paying attention to that. And it seems, I mean, maybe people think it's romantic or something, but I don't mean it that way. I mean, just wake up to the world.
Okay.
The world's amazing.
Yeah.
So, when we see the degradation of the world, we realize how amazing the world is.
Very true.
We need to see it and regard it and bless it so that we don't degrade it.
Agreed.
So I think, you know, those people who identify with New Age movements because they are trying to find a language of blessing, trying to find a way of regarding the gifts of all of nature, God bless them. I mean, it's a good thing to do.
But actually, let's go more on about, you said more about blessing. But actually also the more of the goals and the concept of religion. Just what is worship? Like, is worship more than being a cheerleader to the divine? Or is it a personal experience you experience for personal growth? Is worship to manipulate the divine into doing your bidding? Or is it an experience, or is it to transform yourself? What is worship in your opinion?
Well, I go back to my old teacher, Mercigliado, who talked about the human nature. He said that we are homo adorans. We are man, the adorer.
Okay.
The human nature has an essential need and gift to worship, to adore.
Okay, good.
I would say that this is more important. Well, my way of often putting it is that Maslow, in his hierarchy of needs, had it absolutely upside down.
Really?
When he thinks about food and sex and things of that nature,
I personally agree.
being first. But my argument is that more than anything else,
Yep.
human beings need to adore. need to worship. It's more important than food. That's why saints exist. They need to adore and they need to be adored. So the child that isn't adored withers.
That's very true.
And dies.
That's true.
The child that is adored develops the capacity, or the capacity within them flourishes to adore. And people that have a high regard for the wonder of life and the gifts of creation. So my sense is that worship is the most fundamental thing that human beings do. We know of no place in the history of human evolution where we don't see adoration, where we don't see worship. And some would argue that in some forms of primates and in some other animals, we also see that indicated a little bit too.
Yeah,
I don't know a lot about that.
There's actually been, I've seen videos, they've seen some animals haven't observed actually mourning their dead per se, kind of picking
Of
up
course,
on
yes. And that is a form of regard. So now it is also the case that, as creatures with our kind of mind, with our mind and our concerns, we develop fears and we develop ambitions and appetites. So we can pollute our capacity for adoration. We can pollute our desire for worship. And one of the ways I think we pollute it, and this is strong language, and maybe it's inappropriate for me to speak so strongly about it, but let me just suggest this.
All right.
One of the ways that we pollute it is or disfigure it, or maybe misappropriate it, is when we shift from adoration to propitiation and manipulation.
Okay, go on.
There's a lot of religious life, religious traditions, and spiritual disciplines which are focused on trying to propitiate a deity, trying to get God on my side for what I want. There's a lot of religious discipline and religious action which is about trying to buy off the deity. Trying to get on the right side because I want something or because I'm afraid of something. And that, to my mind, is the antitype of worship.
Okay, go on.
It's the opposite of worship. It looks like worship. When we speak about Christ and the Antichrist, it looks like worship, but it's the anti-form of it. It is to turn it against itself. Why? Because real worship opens your mind and your heart, enlarges your capacity to see the world and to be attentive to the gifts of the world, enlarges your capacity to live with limitations, to accept what is and seek life-giving meaning in what is. Whereas this antitype is trying to reach beyond what is. It's trying to force something. In some ways, it is the big difference between at least the way in which some forms of magic are understood and the way in which a regard for the mystery is understood.
And actually that leads me to a good question. Like some have argued, prayer is manipulation, there are blessings you can give to another human being, there's prayer, there is magic and divination. How do you really define each one? Like how are they different? What are they exactly?
Well, my point, as I've been trying to articulate here, is that this human desire to adore and to worship, which I see as a holy desire, and the deepest part of the human nature, and the greatest gift we have, this desire can be skewed, like all of our desires, like all of our capacities. It can become skewed. It can become deformed. And when it becomes skewed and deformed, it seeks to manipulate something.
All right.
When it isn't skewed and deformed, it opens us. It helps empty us of our passions and desires, and it opens us to the gift of grace that is coming to meet us in the world, no matter what is coming to meet us in the world. And it makes it possible for us to be more attentive to that. So to me, the distinction is pretty simple.
One is you're openly receiving the blessing
Yeah.
versus trying to manipulate.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between accepting and manipulation.
Right. So,
Okay.
but of course, within Christian traditions, there's always been two traditions of prayer,
Okay, go on.
which have usually been fighting with each other. The one tradition is petitionary prayer, or
Okay.
what they call positive prayer. God, please give me this.
The prosperity gospel.
Well, that's an extreme example of it in the modern world, but it's been there all along. This kind of requesting God for things. Now we have to be careful with this. This is part of the human struggle. So prayer is also the playground of struggle. So to say those things is okay. To pray them is okay. But you need to hear them. You need to hear them. Because our prayers, God doesn't need to hear our prayers.
Yeah.
We need to hear our prayers.
Okay.
The whole point of prayer is to hear what you're saying, is to hear your unconscious, is to hear what your fears and desires are, so they can be healed by God.
Healed. Okay.
The only way God can heal them is if you hear them. So there's been this tradition of petitionary prayer and magical prayer and all that stuff. There's another tradition which goes along with it, which is the tradition of prayer as contemplation, prayer as self-emptying, prayer as seeking the still point of the turning world, prayer as going into your closet and drinking the silence. So when we see Jesus in the temple, he talks about these two different kinds of prayer. He talks about the publican standing in the middle of the temple and saying, God, I am so grateful I was not born a Gentile or a woman. And he talks about the sinner, the penitent one, who goes into the corner, into the closet, into his private world, into the depths of his own heart, and simply says, Lord have mercy, heal me.
Heal me.
That's the only real prayer there is, in my view, is the prayer, heal me.
Fascinating.
Heal me so that I can see the wonder of the world again
That's deep.
and participate in the joy of life again. Heal me. So we say in our tradition, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner.
Mercy
So,
has them to heal.
mercy is the word for healing. Pour the oil of gladness on me. You know, eleison, Kyrie eleison. Eleison is mercy in Greek. It's the olive tree, linked to the olive tree. Pour the oil of gladness on the wounds that I have, so that those wounds become supple again, so that I can stand up again, so I can live in the beauty of your world again. That's
deep.
that's the most wonderful gift of prayer, in my view. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David Goa, for answering my questions and many other people's questions as well. So, David Goa from the U of A. All right, take care.